February 1941. The Atlantic was killing Britain slowly, methodically, one convoy at a time. U-boats prowled beneath grey waves with near impunity, whilst corvettes circled helplessly above, their depth charges detonating where submarines had been minutes before. Then a Dover fisherman named Albert Henshaw walked into Admiralty headquarters with coiled rope and an idea so simple that decorated naval officers laughed him from the room. 6 months later, U-boat commanders were reporting the impossible. The clock on the operations room wall at Western Approaches Command in Liverpool read 03:17 on the morning of 11th February 1941. When Commander James Whitfield received confirmation that convoy HX-106 had lost its 9th merchant vessel in 48 hours. The air inside the bunker, 17 feet below ground, stank of cigarette smoke, cold tea, and the particular desperation that came from watching ships disappear from plotting tables whilst being utterly powerless to prevent it. Whitfield stood before the enormous map of the North Atlantic, his uniform rumpled from 72 consecutive hours on duty, and studied the neat X marks representing 23,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom that week alone. Each X represented not merely steel and cargo, but men, merchant seamen, many from Liverpool's own docks, now entombed in freezing darkness 2 miles down. The corvettes arrived within 40 minutes of the attack, his deputy reported, voice hollow with exhaustion. HMS Bluebell dropped 16 depth charges in a standard pattern. ASDIC contact was lost immediately after the first detonations. The U-boat escaped, as they always do, Whitfield replied quietly. The mathematics of failure were brutally simple. Britain imported 43 million tons of materials annually to survive. Food, fuel, munitions, raw materials for factories that worked around the clock to produce weapons. U-boats were sinking merchant shipping at a rate that exceeded new construction by a catastrophic margin. At current attrition rates, statistical models suggested Britain would be starved into negotiated surrender by Christmas 1941. The Royal Navy possessed precisely 107 operational corvettes, small, agile escort vessels designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare. They were crewed by reserve officers and merchant seamen hastily trained in naval procedures, officered by retired commanders recalled from civilian life, and equipped with ASDIC sonar that could theoretically detect submarines at ranges up to 2,000 yards. In theory, corvettes represented Britain's answer to the U-boat menace. In practice, they were failing spectacularly. The problem lay not in detection, but in prosecution. ASDIC allowed corvettes to locate U-boats with reasonable accuracy, but the moment a corvette commenced its attack run, physics conspired against success. The attacking vessel passed directly over the submerged submarine, the ASDIC dome beneath its hull angled forward, thus losing contact with the target for the critical 40 to 60 seconds required to deploy depth charges. During that blind interval, U-boat commanders executed emergency maneuvers, full rudder, emergency dive, ballast adjustments that displaced their vessels 200 yards or more from their last known position. By the time depth charges detonated, submarines had vanished into three-dimensional ocean space too vast to saturate with explosives. Standard doctrine called for patterns of 6 to 8 charges spaced at intervals calculated to cover probable escape vectors. But the ocean offered unlimited escape routes, and corvettes carried limited ammunition. The result was a grim war of attrition Britain was losing. Whitfield had studied every failed engagement report for 6 months. The pattern was maddening in its consistency. Contact established, attack commenced, contact lost, charges dropped, explosions observed, target escaped. Of 137 confirmed attacks since September 1940, precisely 4 had resulted in verified U-boat kills, a 3% success rate. His analysis identified the fundamental tactical contradiction. The very act of attacking guaranteed loss of information at the moment when information became most critical. Radar could not penetrate water. ASDIC required the dome to face the target. Physics itself seemed aligned with the enemy. "What do the operational researchers suggest?" Whitfield asked, though he already knew the answer. "Tighter patterns, more charges per attack, coordination between multiple escorts," his deputy recited. "All solutions require resources we don't possess. More escorts, more depth charges, more training time, everything we lack." Through the night, similar conversations occurred in bunkers, wardrooms, and admiralty offices across Britain. The nation that had ruled the waves for 3 centuries found itself stymied by an enemy it could detect but not destroy, stalked by submarines that transformed the Atlantic into a killing ground where British seamen died whilst German crews escaped with near impunity. In Dover, 130 miles southeast of Liverpool, Albert Henshaw sat in the cramped wheelhouse of his trawler Resolute, moored against the quay, whilst February rain hammered the canvas awnings. The boat that had fed his family for 23 years now served the Admiralty as a patrol vessel, its nets replaced with depth charges, its crew of cousins and nephews now wearing Navy surplus coats and scanning for mines. Henshaw was 54, weathered by decades of North Sea gales, hands scarred by cable and net, face lined by salt wind and constant squinting against glare. He possessed precisely 8 years of formal schooling, a lifetime of practical seamanship, and the particular stubborn streak common to men who earned their bread from hostile water. He also possessed an idea that would not leave him alone. For weeks, Henshaw had listened to naval officers in Dover's pubs complaining about U-boats escaping despite being dead to rights before attacks. The technical explanations washed over him, ASDIC angles, contact intervals, charge patterns, but the fundamental problem was instantly familiar to any fisherman. You lost track of your target the moment you needed to act upon it. Trawling for fish required maintaining continuous awareness of net position whilst the vessel moved. Lose track of your net, and you risked fouling the propeller, snagging bottom obstacles, or losing your catch entirely. Henshaw's solution had always been simple: rope. Specifically, a messenger line, a lightweight rope paid out astern whilst trawling, marked at measured intervals, that provided continuous tactile feedback about net position. A trawlerman could close his eyes and, by feeling the rope's tension and the passing of knots beneath his hand, know precisely where his net was at any moment. Sitting in Resolute's wheelhouse whilst rain drummed overhead, Henshaw sketched his idea on the back of a fuel requisition form. If a Corvette deployed a similar marker line, dropped from the stern with small floats at measured intervals, just before passing over a detected U-boat, that line would remain floating directly above the submarine's last known position after the Corvette passed beyond ASDIC range. The attacking vessel could then look astern and see exactly where its target had been, adjusting its depth charge drop accordingly. The idea was so simple that Henshaw hesitated for 3 days before mentioning it to Lieutenant Commander George Hartley, the reserve officer commanding Dover's patrol section. Hartley, a peacetime insurance broker who found himself commanding small vessels in wartime, listened politely while standing in Resolute's wheelhouse on a grey afternoon, then gently explained why Henshaw's idea was impractical. "Depth charges detonate with enormous force, Mr. Henshaw. Any marker line would be destroyed instantly by the first explosion, and U-boats don't remain stationary. They're executing emergency maneuvers the moment they realize they've been detected. Your floats would mark where the submarine was, not where it is." Henshaw nodded slowly, acknowledging both objections. Then he asked the question that would change the Battle of the Atlantic. "But, sir, wouldn't knowing exactly where the bugger was, even 30 seconds ago, be better than guessing wildly where he might be now?" Hartley did not immediately dismiss Henshaw's counter-argument, because he had spent 6 months watching corvettes expend thousands of depth charges for negligible results, whilst merchant seamen died in burning oil. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Educated guessing was producing a 3% kill rate. Perhaps a fisherman's intuition, however unorthodox, deserved consideration. He authorized Henshaw to conduct a small-scale trial using Resolute during the next training exercise scheduled for 19th February. The Admiralty would provide no resources, no official sanction, no interference. If the idea proved worthless, it would be quietly forgotten. If it showed promise, Hartley would forward a report through proper channels. Henshaw spent 4 days in his workshop behind the cottage he shared with his wife, Margaret, fabricating the prototype marker system using materials scrounged from Dover's docks. The base was ordinary hemp rope, 3/4-inch diameter, treated with tar for water resistance. Every 20 feet, he spliced in small wooden floats, sections of broom handle whittled to cylinders, painted bright yellow, each marked with ascending numbers painted in black. The deployment mechanism was equally improvised. A wooden reel, salvaged from electrical cable, mounted on a simple bracket holding 200 feet of marked line. A quick-release clip allowed the entire assembly to be dropped overboard instantly when needed. Total cost, 7 shillings and 6pence, plus 43 hours of labor performed by lamplight after patrol duties. Margaret watched her husband work with the patient resignation of a fisherman's wife accustomed to obsessive projects. When he finally completed the assembly at 2:30 in the morning on 18th February, she brought tea and asked the question wives ask when husbands pursue quixotic endeavors. Do you truly believe the Navy will care what a Dover fisherman thinks about hunting submarines? Henshaw tested the reel's mechanism, ensuring smooth payout. No, love, but I believe they'll care about dead U-boats. If this works, they'll use it. If it doesn't, I've wasted rope and sleep. Either way, I'll know I tried. The training exercise commenced at 09 Xils on a bitterly cold morning with force 4 winds kicking up 2-meter swells. The enemy was HMS Tamarisk, a corvette volunteering to play submarine by running submerged ASDIC patterns to simulate U-boat behavior. Resolute's role was to make mock attacks whilst observers from Dover's anti-submarine school evaluated tactics. Hartley came aboard Resolute for the exercise, curious despite his skepticism. Henshaw mounted his marker reel on the stern rail using cargo straps, explaining the procedure with the plain language of a man describing obvious solutions to obvious problems. We establish ASDIC contact and commence the approach run exactly per standard doctrine. 500 yards from target position, I drop the marker line. The reel pays out freely as we advance. Floats deploy every 20 feet, creating a visible reference line on the surface pointing directly back at the U-boat's position when we made the drop. When we pass over the target and lose ASDIC contact, we don't guess where the submarine is now. We look astern and see exactly where it was 30 seconds ago. We adjust the depth charge drop based on visible displacement of the floats from our stern position. Hartley frowned, working through the logic. But the U-boat will have moved during those 30 seconds. Aye, sir, but we'll know the starting point of that movement with perfect accuracy instead of approximate guessing. A submarine can't teleport. If we know where it started and can estimate speed and heading, we can predict where it is now with far better precision than current methods provide. The first approach commenced at 09:47. Resolute's improvised ASDIC set, borrowed equipment operated by a young rating who normally served aboard a corvette, detected Tamarisk's simulated submarine signature at 1,000 yards. Henshaw conned the trawler directly toward the contact. Throttle advanced to 15 knots. Crew braced against the swell. At 500 yards, he deployed the marker line. The reel spun freely. Hemp rope snaking out astern, yellow floats popping to the surface at measured intervals, creating a visible track across grey water pointing directly back at Resolute's position 30 seconds prior. The geometry was instantly apparent. As Resolute advanced, the line of floats remained stationary, marking the precise track of approach. When Henshaw passed over the target position and lost ASDIC contact, the critical blind interval where U-boats escaped, he immediately looked astern and saw the float line displaced 15 degrees to port of Resolute's wake. That 15-degree displacement was not guesswork or ASDIC interpretation. It was observable fact, visible to the naked eye, requiring no instruments and no calculation. Tamarisk had maneuvered to port during the approach run. Therefore, depth charges should be dropped with a corresponding port offset to compensate for the target's last known movement vector. Henshaw made the correction, calling for the practice charges, weighted barrels, to be released with the calculated offset. Tamarisk's commander, monitoring the exercise, later reported that the barrels impacted within 50 yards of his vessel's position, a hit that would have achieved certain kill had they been live depth charges. The second and third approach runs yielded similar results. The marker line, regardless of sea conditions or maneuvering, provided consistent, accurate reference to target position at the critical moment when ASDIC lost contact. The method introduced no complicated calculations, required no additional crew training, depended on no temperamental equipment. It was simply rope, floats, and human eyeballs providing information that had previously been unavailable. By 13, Hartley was drafting his report with the convert's enthusiasm of a skeptic confronted by undeniable results. He titled it, Proposed Enhancement to Anti-Submarine Attack Doctrine Using Surface Markers, and spent 2 pages describing Henshaw's method in technical language designed to satisfy Admiralty bureaucrats. The report reached Western Approach's command on 24th February. Commander Whitfield read it twice, then walked down 3 flights of stairs to the experimental weapons section and demanded they build 50 prototype marker reels using Henshaw's specifications by the end of March. "This is a fisherman's improvisation," the section head protested. "Surely we should conduct proper engineering analysis, develop standardized specifications, test various materials. We should deploy it immediately to operational corvettes and determine whether it kills U-boats." Whitfield interrupted. "Analysis can occur after we've stopped losing 3 merchant ships per day. Build the bloody reels." By 15th March, 47 corvettes operating from Liverpool, Londonderry and Greenock had been equipped with marker reels. The cordage came from Navy stores, the floats from hastily repurposed lifebuoy components, the reels from workshops across Britain working overtime. Each assembly cost £4 sterling and could be installed in 90 minutes. The technical name assigned by Admiralty documentation was Anti-Submarine Attack Reference Line, Type 1. Corvette crews, with the serviceman's instinct for practical nomenclature, called them Henshaw markers, or more commonly, the BARMY fisherman's rope. Indeed, the first operational deployment occurred on 19th of March, when HMS Gladiolus encountered U-99 south of Iceland. The corvette's commander, Lieutenant Commander Hugh Crofton, had received his marker reel 3 days prior with minimal instruction and considerable skepticism. When Gladiolus detected U-99 at 1,400 yards and commenced its attack run, Crofton deployed the marker line primarily because standing orders required it, not because he believed it would materially affect outcome. When Gladiolus lost ASDIC contact, and Crofton looked astern to see the float line displace sharply to starboard, indicating the U-boat had executed a hard turn during the approach, he adjusted his depth charge drop 30 degrees right of his original aim point. 4 of the 8 charges detonated within lethal radius of U-99's pressure hull. The submarine suffered catastrophic flooding, lost depth control, and surfaced 70 seconds later in a mass of escaping air and fuel oil. 43 crew members were rescued before U-99 sank for the final time. It was the Royal Navy's first U-boat kill in 17 days. U-boat Command headquarters in Lorient, France, occupied a concrete bunker complex so heavily fortified that RAF bombing raids produced more noise than damage. Inside the operations room on the morning of 3rd April 1941, Captain Zursee Hans-Georg von Friedeburg studied patrol reports from the North Atlantic with growing concern that shaded toward professional alarm. 8 U-boats had been lost in March, double the previous month's total and the highest monthly attrition since the war began. Two had been sunk by corvettes under circumstances that operational analysis found deeply troubling. Both commanders had executed textbook evasion maneuvers the moment they detected ASDIC ranging, yet both had been destroyed by depth charges that impacted with what patrol reports described as uncanny accuracy. Von Friedeberg spread the engagement charts across his desk and traced the attack patterns with a finger scarred by decades of naval service. Standard doctrine required U-boat commanders, upon detecting ASDIC contact, to immediately execute hard turns, while simultaneously diving deeper and adjusting ballast to alter trim. These maneuvers, performed within the 60-second window when attacking vessels lost sonar contact, had proven remarkably effective at spoiling enemy aim, until suddenly they hadn't. "The British are compensating perfectly for our evasion turns," he told his intelligence officer. "Depth charges are detonating precisely where our commanders maneuvered to, not where our boats were when initially detected. This represents either impossibly lucky guessing or a fundamental change in their attack methodology." The intelligence officer, a former merchant captain who spoke English fluently, had compiled fragmentary evidence from interrogated survivors and decoded radio intercepts. 3 corvettes involved in successful attacks were heard referencing something called henshaw over open channels. "We have no record of this in our recognition books. It may be a new weapon system, a code name for revised tactics, or possibly an officer's name." "Find out which," von Friedeberg ordered. "If the British have developed an effective counter to our evasion doctrine, every boat in the Atlantic is compromised." The investigation proved frustratingly difficult. British operational security regarding anti-submarine methods remained excellent, despite German intelligence efforts. But on 17th of April, reconnaissance photographs taken by a Focke-Wulf Condor on long-range patrol captured an image that transformed German understanding of what they faced. The photograph showed a British corvette conducting an attack run against a target outside the frame. Clearly visible in the water astern of the corvette was a line of small objects, floats or markers, deployed in a precise geometric pattern. The intelligence analysts who examined the photograph initially dismissed it as debris, or perhaps life jackets from a previous engagement, until a junior lieutenant who had served aboard merchant vessels before the war recognized what he was seeing. "That's a trawler's guideline," he explained, pointing at the telltale regular spacing of the floats. "Fishing vessels use similar rope to track net positions, but this one is marked with measurement indicators. It's a position reference system." The revelation that Britain was using rope, literally rope, the sort of equipment medieval sailors would recognize, to defeat sophisticated U-boat tactics, produced reactions ranging from professional respect to bitter incredulity. Von Friedeberg spent 20 minutes examining the photograph before rendering his assessment. "It's brilliant, precisely because it's simple. They're not trying to track our submarines during the attack run. They're marking their own position, creating a visible reference that shows where we were when they lost contact. Then, they observe our evasion maneuvers by watching how our position displaces relative to their marker line. They're using our own movements against us." The tactical implications were catastrophic. Every German evasion doctrine assumed that attacking vessels would lose precise targeting information during the critical attack interval. That assumption had just been invalidated by a fisherman's rope costing less than £5 sterling. German naval architects proposed countermeasures: deeper crash dive capabilities, faster turn rates, randomized evasion patterns designed to defeat predictive targeting. All required modifications to existing boats that would take months to implement and provided no protection to submarines already on patrol. U-boat commanders at sea received revised tactical guidance on 22nd April. British escorts now employ surface marker systems that reveal evasion maneuvers. When under attack, execute maximum speed random heading changes with frequent reversals. Do not maintain constant heading for longer than 20 seconds. Accept the increased risk of mechanical stress. Survival requires unpredictability. The new doctrine acknowledged that German tactical advantage had evaporated. U-boats could still evade. Random maneuvering remained difficult to predict, but success now depended on luck rather than methodology. The Wolfpack tactics that had devastated Allied convoys presumed German submarines could dictate the terms of engagement, attacking when advantageous and escaping when threatened. Henshaw markers had fundamentally altered that equation. British corvette commanders noticed the change immediately. U-boats began executing wild, almost panicked evasion patterns, hard turns, followed by immediate reversals, random speed changes, ballast adjustments that sent submarines yo-yoing through depth layers. The tactics occasionally succeeded in avoiding depth charges, but they were exhausting for crews, punishing for machinery, and catastrophically inefficient for patrol operations. More significantly, the frantic maneuvering often displaced U-boats directly into positions where other escorts could acquire ASDIC contact. Convoy defense had always been a numbers game. Henshaw markers transformed it into geometry, where erratic German evasion created multiple intercept opportunities for British vessels coordinating their attacks. Kill rates climbed steadily. 7 U-boats in April, 11 in May, 14 in June. Each loss represented not merely a submarine, but 44 trained crew members and 6 months of construction time that Germany's strained industrial capacity could barely sustain. By July 1941, U-boat command was advising commanders that encountering corvettes equipped with marker systems represented extreme danger conditions, requiring immediate disengagement. The hunters had become the hunted, and Admiral Karl Dönitz, architect of Germany's submarine strategy, acknowledged in his private journal that the tactical superiority we enjoyed has been negated by an absurdly simple British innovation. In Dover, Albert Henshaw continued fishing patrols aboard Resolute, now recognized by colleagues but largely unknown to the broader public. He had received official commendation from Western Approaches Command and a personal letter from the First Sea Lord acknowledging his contribution. The letter lived in his kitchen drawer beneath spare charts, rarely mentioned. When pressed by Margaret about his role in changing the Atlantic War, Henshaw offered the modest assessment characteristic of men who solve problems rather than celebrate solutions. "I just thought of something practical." The clever bit was the officers who recognized it might work and gave it a try. That takes more courage than thinking up ideas in a wheelhouse. The unconditional surrender of Germany on 8th of May 1945 concluded a conflict in which Britain had survived by the narrowest of margins. Post-war analysis by the Strategic Bombing Survey and naval historians attempted to quantify exactly how close the nation had come to starvation-induced collapse during the darkest months of 1941. The conclusion was sobering: approximately 6 weeks. Had U-boat effectiveness continued at February 1941 levels through spring and summer, Britain's food imports would have fallen below sustainable minimums by mid-July, precipitating rationing so severe that industrial production would have collapsed and civilian morale would have approached breaking point. Henshaw markers had not single-handedly won the Battle of the Atlantic. That victory required radar, escort carriers, code-breaking, American industrial production, and the courage of tens of thousands of merchant seamen. But the markers had bought time at the precise moment when time was Britain's scarcest resource. Statistical analysis revealed the magnitude of impact. Between March and December 1941, Corvettes equipped with marker systems achieved an 18% U-boat kill rate during prosecuted attacks, 6 times the 3% rate documented before marker deployment. That improvement translated to 67 confirmed U-boat sinkings, attributable directly or indirectly to marker-enhanced attacks, during the critical period when Germany's submarine fleet was still relatively small, and each loss materially affected operational capacity. More significantly, the markers forced tactical changes that reduced U-boat effectiveness, even when attacks failed. German commanders spent less time positioning for optimal attack angles and more time executing defensive maneuvers. Patrol endurance decreased as submarines consumed fuel and battery power on evasion rather than hunting. The psychological burden of knowing that British escorts possessed reliable targeting information eroded German confidence, introducing hesitation into a force that had previously operated with near impunity. By 1943, when Allied advantages in radar, aircraft coverage, and numerical superiority rendered the Atlantic increasingly lethal for U-boats, Henshaw markers had become so thoroughly integrated into standard anti-submarine doctrine that many junior officers believed they had always been present. Training manuals described marker deployment with the same matter-of-fact tone used for all established procedures, and the markers themselves had evolved into manufactured assemblies produced by naval workshops with standardized specifications. But old hands remembered. In Corvette wardrooms and fleet anchorages, the story of the Dover fisherman who changed the Atlantic War became part of naval folklore, told with variations, embellishments, and the particular affection British servicemen reserved for tales of inspired improvisation defeating German engineering. Albert Henshaw received official recognition in November 1945 when he was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire for services to anti-submarine warfare. The ceremony at Buckingham Palace bemused him considerably. He wore his only suit, borrowed his son-in-law's tie, and stood in line with industrialists, civil servants, and officers whose contributions to victory spanned years rather than afternoons in workshops. When King George VI pinned the medal to his coat and asked what inspired his innovation, Henshaw offered the honest answer, "I just wanted to help our boys stop losing, Your Majesty. It seemed wrong that we could find the submarines but couldn't catch them. A fisherman knows you need to see where your target is, even when you can't look directly at it. Just applied what I knew about nets to depth charges." The king, who had served in the Royal Navy and understood seamanship, nodded with the knowing look of one sailor, recognizing another's practical logic. "Your net caught quite a haul, Mr. Henshaw. The nation is grateful." Henshaw returned to Dover and resumed fishing operations aboard Resolute, which the Admiralty returned to civilian service in January 1946. He worked the North Sea for another 9 years until arthritis made hauling nets impossible, then retired to the cottage overlooking Dover's harbour, where he could watch trawlers and ferries navigate the straits. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime contribution. The story lived primarily in naval archives, historical analyses, and the memories of veterans who served on corvettes during the desperate years. Occasionally, naval historians would journey to Dover to interview him, and he would patiently explain the logic that had seemed obvious to a fisherman but revolutionary to the Navy. One persistent interviewer asked why the Admiralty's trained engineers and tacticians hadn't conceived of marker systems before a civilian suggested the idea. Henshaw considered the question whilst preparing tea in his kitchen, then offered an answer that captured something essential about innovation under pressure. The officers knew too much about how things were supposed to work. They were trying to make complicated solutions to complicated problems. I didn't know the proper way, so I just thought about the simple way. Sometimes not knowing the rules lets you see answers that the rule followers miss. That philosophy, that expertise could blind as readily as it illuminated, that sometimes an outsider's perspective revealed solutions invisible to insiders, became embedded in British naval doctrine. Post-war anti-submarine development deliberately sought input from unconventional sources. Merchant captains, fishermen, even submarine commanders invited to critique the tactics used against them. The physical markers themselves evolved considerably. By the 1950s, they incorporated chemical light sources for night operations, radio beacons for precise positioning, and biodegradable materials to prevent oceanic pollution. Modern iterations use GPS-equipped buoys communicating wirelessly with attacking vessels, but the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Create a visible, persistent reference that reveals target behavior during intervals when direct observation is impossible. Henshaw died in January 1968, aged 81, survived by Margaret, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had seen a problem and solved it without seeking glory. His obituary in the Dover Express mentioned his MBE and his fishing career, but devoted only 2 paragraphs to the contribution that had helped turn the Battle of the Atlantic. But in Western Approaches Command's museum, now preserved as a memorial to the campaign that nearly lost the war, Henshaw's original prototype marker reel occupied a place of honor in the Anti-Submarine Warfare Gallery. A brass plaque explained its history in language that would have made its creator smile. This improvised device, fabricated by Dover fisherman Albert Henshaw using rope and broom handle, demonstrated that effective solutions to complex tactical problems need not be technologically sophisticated. By enabling Corvette commanders to observe U-boat evasion maneuvers during attack runs, Henshaw markers increased anti-submarine kill rates 6-fold during the critical period of 1941-1942, buying Britain precious time when time was measured in weeks of food imports. The marker system proved that practical seamanship and clear thinking could defeat advanced technology, and that contributions to national survival came from unexpected sources when citizens applied their particular skills to urgent needs. Henshaw's innovation exemplified the British principle that when confronted by seemingly intractable challenges, the solution might be found not in laboratories, but in the practical wisdom of those who work the sea. Historians evaluating Britain's survival during its finest hour identified multiple factors: Churchill's leadership, radar development, code breaking at Bletchley Park, American material support, the courage of fighter pilots during the Blitz. To that list, careful analysis added a less celebrated but equally vital contribution: a Dover fisherman who looked at the problem of escaping submarines and thought, what if we just used rope? It was not the most glamorous weapon of the war, nor the most technologically advanced, but measured by the ratio of resource investment to strategic impact, Henshaw markers ranked among the most cost-effective innovations deployed by any combatant during the entire conflict. 7 shillings, 6pence, and 43 hours of work. Against that investment stood 67 confirmed U-boat kills, hundreds of merchant ships that completed their voyages unmolested, millions of tons of supplies that reached Britain when survival depended on each shipment, and perhaps most significantly, the validation that innovation need not emerge from institutions with vast resources and credentialed experts. Sometimes the solution lived in the mind of someone who understood the fundamental problem because he had solved similar problems his entire working life, and who possessed the stubbornness to pursue an idea even when decorated officers dismissed it as balmy. The Atlantic would claim many more lives before victory came, and no single innovation guaranteed that victory. But in February 1941, when Britain stood on the precipice and U-boats ruled the seas, a fisherman's rope helped change the equation. History remembers the great battles, the famous commanders, the dramatic turning points. But sometimes the hinge upon which fate turned was neither grand nor obvious, just a practical man who saw a problem, thought about his work, and quietly changed the course of a war. The Atlantic's most dangerous waters were conquered not by admirals, but by ordinary people with extraordinary ideas. If this untold story moved you, subscribe now. We uncover Britain's hidden wartime heroes weekly. What other unsung innovations changed history? Share your theories below. Next week, we reveal how a Welsh librarian's filing system helped win D-Day. Ring the bell so you don't miss it.